Test 1, 2, 3.
Does yours work?
Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Okay. Well, we're going to start if the people of God will come to order. Evidently, they won't. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. We have a lot to get through this morning, and Jay in particular challenged me that it better be good because he's giving up an extra hour to be here. So, with that in mind, let's start. For some of you, this will be a repeat of something that I did about a year and a half ago, but I think it's a good introduction to Luke and any of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because we need to place Luke in the context of how the Gospels themselves developed so that we can ultimately understand Luke's particular message and how it differs from those of his, I don't want to say contemporaries necessarily, but his brethren. So just to start with, the word gospel, which we don't think about a whole lot because we hear it every Sunday, the gospel, reading from the gospel, etc. We know it means good news for the most part. We all know that. It comes from the Greek word euangelion, which in Latin became evangelium. And we're familiar with the English words evangelist, for evangelist, and certainly to evangelize, which is part of the mission of the church, to preach the gospel. That is, to preach the good news. The interesting thing that I found in preparing for this lecture the first time is that the word in Greek, the euangelion, is very similar to the Hebrew word BSR, which I cannot pronounce, and I don't think anyone can unless maybe there is somebody who speaks Hebrew here. I have trouble with words that don't have vowels. But it's a particular kind of good news. It's the good news of God's victory or Israel's victory. So it's the good news about salvation, about God's breaking in and acting in the world. So it's not just good news like we don't read in the newspaper anymore, but it's a particular kind of good news. The other thing that's interesting, I know when I was growing up, and I'm older than many of you, I kind of thought of the Gospels as biographies of Jesus. But they really aren't. And Scripture scholars who really got unleashed into the modern understanding of Scripture in the late 40s and early 50s began to look at how the Gospels are different and how they're the same or similar to other ancient literature. So they're very different from the pagan biographies that were being written at the time, which was to glorify the figure. Today you sometimes hear of biographies of famous people being called hagiographies, where all they talk about is how wonderful the person is, and they don't talk about any of the negative things that they might have done or been involved in. Well, that was the nature of most pagan biographies. It was to exalt the person being biographied. Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, is more close to what the Gospels are. The book of Jeremiah is the story of how Jeremiah is called and how he lives out the message that God gives him for the salvation of the people of Israel. And if you change one word in that sentence to Jesus, that's what the Gospels are. It's the story of how Jesus is called, empowered by God, to preach God's message to the people of his day. So it has a very specific meaning. Okay, Normally I take questions at the end, and I will, but because this is a little more complicated stuff that we're talking about today, feel free if you have a question to raise your hand. The other thing to move to now, Roman numeral 2, is the stages of the formation of the written gospel. Again, when I was growing up, we kind of had a dictation model that, Luke and Matthew and Mark and John were just kind of, God was dictating to them, and they wrote everything down that God said. We now know that that's not true, that the Gospels, the written Gospels, began as an oral tradition. The people who were alive during the time of Jesus, who heard Jesus preach, began to talk to others about what they had learned, began to recount the stories orally. And you know what happens when you recount stories orally? They change, right? Ever played telephone? I mean, if I asked all of you today after this lecture what you remembered, everybody's going to have a slightly different story, okay? So, and there are two pathways for the kind of oral tradition behind the gospel. So not only did the people who were followers of Jesus, and then the ones maybe immediately after him who heard the stories from the people who were around him, not only did they transmit things orally, but Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He didn't have a stump speech that was repeated over and over again. He changed what he said based on the audience he was talking to. So when he was talking to farmers, he used agrarian metaphors. When he was talking to fishermen, he used fishing metaphors. So, and sometimes he might use the same story and say it a little differently. That's the nature of being an itinerant preacher. You're kind of responding to what's going on. So even it's not surprising that the people who were around Jesus would remember different things because he said different things at different times, as any itinerant preacher would do. So you've got all of that stuff that is in the mix, and that's going on from the time of Jesus until around 60 AD. So we traditionally think of Jesus' death as 30 in the Common Era. So there's about a 30-year period where this oral tradition is flourishing. So I've kind of, I think, covered point one there in a roundabout way. One thing that's important. The other thing that's going on in this first 30 years is Christian liturgy is developing. Now, we don't know a lot about what that liturgy was like, but some of the stories that are being told in liturgical contexts. So they start to become perhaps the more remembered stories because they have a kind of official nature to them. And each area of the church in that time might have emphasized different stories as part of their liturgy. So around 60, we get the first written gospel, which is Mark. And he writes in about 65 of the Common Era. Part of the reason that we're able to date Mark in 65 and say that he's the earliest of the written Gospels is that Jerusalem, you may recall, was attacked by Rome and conquered and destroyed. I mean, the temple was destroyed and everything in 70 AD. Mark shows no real awareness that has happened, whereas it's very clear in Matthew and Luke that they are aware of the temple's destruction. So the first, as I say, the first gospel starts out in 65. Now again, Mark was not an eyewitness. It's 30 years after Jesus died. People didn't live that long back then, okay? But he's heard the stories and he compiles the gospel, this first gospel. We think that it was written in Rome because in Mark's gospel, there's a lot of Latin expressions using the lingua franca of the Roman Empire that work their way into the gospel that we don't see in the other gospels. It appears that he was writing to a non-Jewish community. So keep in mind, in the early church, right, we had the people who were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, so they became Christians. They were considered the Jewish Christians. And then there were Gentiles, the people who were not Jews, who heard the preaching of the apostles and became Christian without having first become Jewish. So Mark's community seems to be made up primarily of this latter group, the non-Jewish community. And they're undergoing persecution. We know there was persecution of the Christians during the time of the Roman Empire. And it's a community that has lost members because of the difficulty of remaining faithful in the face of persecution. Now, if we were doing a series on Mark, and Charles did that before, we could go into more detail about that. So you kind of take my word on that for now, okay? But it's clear in the way, it's clear in a lot of ways. One of the things that's so true in Mark's gospel, he must use the word immediately. I don't know, Charles, you know how many times? 50, 65? I mean, it's immediately. There's this sense of urgency in Mark's gospel that is reflective of the urgent situation that this community found itself in. And we're called to follow Jesus in the midst of all of that. Okay. I'm turning to page 2. Matthew, and I mean, I love the way scripture scholars say this, written around 80 to 90 of the Common Era, give or take a decade. So it's very hard to pin these things down because we don't have written gospels that are extant, that we can go and look at, that exist until around 110. So that's the oldest written ones we have. So we're doing this extrapolation to find this. Matthew was probably a Jewish Christian, and you may remember when we talked about Matthew, for those of you who were here, Matthew has his basic aim of showing how Jesus fulfills the Jewish scriptures and how he's the new Moses. That would make sense if you're writing to a Jewish Christian audience, right? You want to help them understand how Jesus is the fulfillment of all those promises that we've lived with for hundreds of years. And I just give you one example to emphasize that. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus gives what we traditionally talk about all the time as the Sermon on the Mount. What is Moses most associated with? Going up onto the mountain to receive the law from God. In Luke, Jesus gives this same sermon on a plain. Okay? Luke's not concerned about what Matthew's concerned about. But Matthew is got this theological purpose. Now, this Jewish Christian church that is the primary audience for Matthew has also become increasingly Gentile in composition because it was written in the Antioch region. And so Antioch was a thriving metropolitan region at that time. So you have lots of non-Jewish people there, and they're getting converted to Christianity. So Matthew's community is a community where you have Jewish Christians and you have Gentile Christians. Unlike Mark, pretty much just Gentile Christians. So there's some tension in there. And some of that tension we know about through the writings of Paul and the Acts of the Apostles. There was this question of do these Gentile Christians have to follow all of the teachings of the Mosaic law, like circumcision and abstaining from eating meat and dairy and not eating pork and things like that. And so there's tension in his community, and that comes through in Matthew's gospel in a variety of ways. One of the ways it does is in a long section which scholars call Jesus' teaching to the church. And he's talking about division, and he's talking about how to remain faithful in the face of conflict, and how to remain faithful when there are false prophets who try to tell you to go in different directions. So you can see where Matthew's concerned about this conflict that's going on between the two parts of his community. Luke, who of course we're going to be talking about a lot in the next 2 weeks, is written around the same time of Matthew, maybe a little later, but again, give or take 5 or 10 years, who knows. The primary audience seems to be Gentile Christians and those who were affected by Paul's ministry. Remember that Paul makes the point over and over again, God called me to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? So he's going all around that Mediterranean basin, and he's preaching primarily to Gentiles. There is a lot of scriptural scholar basis, that's not a good way of saying it, but I think you know what I mean, for saying that Luke was probably a companion of Paul, at least part of the time. So he's very familiar with the churches that Paul has founded in many ways or has strengthened. The other thing that is very interesting about Luke, he may have been a convert to Judaism first before becoming Christian, and he is a very educated Greek speaker. If you look, and no offense to people who are particular fans of Mark or Matthew, Luke has just an amazing literary form to the whole way he writes his gospel. And that has made preparing the next 2 lectures much harder to do because it's so fascinating, it's so complex. He weaves together things in amazing ways. So he's an erudite guy, and his Greek is much better than Mark's or Matthew's. And we'll save more of that till later. But to just say something about John, who is, the oddball out in all of this. John is written much, much later. People will say as early as 80, but I think the consensus is that it's much closer to 100. Probably in Ephesus or Syria. The author of the gospel was familiar with both Palestine. He knows the geography of Palestine. Whether he knows it from personal experience or because he is attuned to the people who talked about it or not, we don't know. And he's very familiar with Jewish rituals. Think about the wedding feast at Cana and the wine and the water and all that stuff. He's very familiar with Jewish tradition. And there's evidence, very clear evidence, that John wrote his gospel after the Jews expelled the Christians from the synagogue. So keep in mind, remember we had Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. The Gentile Christians don't get caught up in all of this, but the Jewish Christians are trying to say they're Jews, but we also believe this other thing, and eventually that becomes very much of a conflict. And the Pharisees, who really kind of run the synagogues, kind of excommunicate the Christians. And so in John's gospel, more than in any of the others, although Jesus is always in conflict with the authorities of his day, John tends to summarize that and say, the Jews. The Jews did this, the Jews did that, the Jews questioned Jesus, the Jews were in conflict with Jesus, because he's basing that on what's happened in the community that he's writing to where the Jews have expelled the Christians from the synagogue. Now, the other thing that I think is important to just say is, John is not, Scripture scholars believe, one of the 12, which, he is the only one whose name matches one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. But rather, it's believed that the author of the gospel, is not necessarily the beloved disciple, but the beloved disciple, whoever he was, there were a group of people who he evangelized, who became his community, and then in the tradition of the beloved disciple, the Gospel of John is written. And I probably should have started by saying this about the naming of the Gospels. One of the ways that you make in those days, and even to some extent in these days, you make what you're writing important is to attach to it the name of somebody who is even more important than you. So if Matthew wrote the gospel, it's much better than if Ron Boggio wrote the gospel, right? So that's the way this tradition developed of naming these gospels after particular figures. Now, whether those figures had some historic relevance, they were not the people who actually wrote the gospel, but we could say within the traditions that developed around those people. The final point to say here is that the 4 canonical gospels, and I'll say in a minute I'll say more about what I mean by canonical, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were pretty much universally accepted within the church as the 4 authentic gospels by about 150 of the Common Era. So again, think how long that is, 120 years after Jesus' death, before this kind of comes together. And that's because there's a whole lot of other gospels out there that are non-canonical, meaning the church never accepted them as authentic. There's a gospel of Thomas. I think there's a gospel of Peter. Either of the other religious professionals here remember any of the others?
Peter, Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. Yeah. And, in some of these Gospels, the boy Jesus is turning, birds into other kinds of animals and doing all sorts of interesting things. But those Gospels did not become part of the canon. Now, some of those Gospels have been very important in Scripture study because they were written around the same time. So we can learn something about the milieu, something about the language, what the language means, but they were never accepted as authentic gospels by the church. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second before we talk about the synoptic problem and just ask if there are any questions. Yes? We'll let Charles get the microphone to you.
Forgive me if you've explained this already, Ron, but the order, why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John when it seems like Mark is the original?
Right. So Matthew, that's a very good question. I'll repeat it in case it wasn't heard. Why is the order that we typically think of and the way they appear in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when in fact historically that's not the order in which they appear? The best answer for that is that the Gospel of Matthew began to be used liturgically very, very early in the history of the church. And that fact filtered into the thinking of the people who decided which of these Gospels were okay and which weren't, the canonical Gospels. So they gave Matthew pride of precedence. Whether or not in 150 they thought Matthew was the first written or not, I don't know. I probably should know that, but I don't know. But it really isn't, that's not their concern. Their concern was the precedence of that gospel. Any other questions? Yes, Bob. Just wait 1 second.
How should I understand Judaica? You have Palestine and Judaica.
So what does Judaica mean? Judaica is the traditions and customs associated with Judaism. So the ritual washings, remember how Jesus at one point takes on the Pharisees about being overly concerned about outwardly things and washing their hands. And another point, when the woman comes in and washes his feet, and they're all scandalized, and he said, you didn't even offer me a basin to wash my hands, which according to your tradition you should have. And here she's washing her feet with her own tears. So it's all of the, it's kind of like we might call, what we might say, Americana. All of the things that are part of the common culture. No, it's more it's the religious aspect. Anything else before we go? Yes, Don.
What is the canon, and what does canonical mean?
Okay, so I thought I said that, but maybe not clearly. Because there were all these writings floating around, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul, other epistles, and there were other gospels floating around, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the church as a group decided in 150 that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the only official or canonical gospels. So the word canonical means official, approved by the church. Okay?
So what led to that decision? People said we're the authorities, therefore this is it. There wasn't anything.
Well, they were the authorities. They would have been the bishops and the leaders of the church at those times who came together from different parts of the church at that time and kind of made that decision.
Okay. My other question for you is, these were all written by people who were inside the religious community. Have they ever found many writings about Jesus that are kind of outside that were not trying to support the religion itself, but support him as a historical figure and maybe more as an influencer in Palestine at that time?
Influencer, what a 21st century word. Well, yes, but very little. And now I'm blocking on the person.
Josephus was a Jewish historian of the time.
A Jewish historian mentions Jesus as a teacher, but there is no real documentation, and mentions that he dies, and mentions that there are Christians. But there's no real development of his life, the meaning, any of that kind of stuff from secular sources. Okay, let me move on now, because I knew I just should not have done that about letting questions start, but it's okay. All right, so the synoptic problem. Synoptic, in this sense, means similar. So you don't have to be a scripture scholar to open the New Testament and see that there are a lot of similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John is a whole different thing. John has discourses about the bread of life. John has discourses about the living water. And of course, he has other actions of Jesus that don't appear in the other three Gospels. The one that keeps coming to mind is the wedding feast at Cana, and etc. And you just look at the language of John's Gospel, even in English, it's so different. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke share similarities, but they also share some very important differences. So as Scripture, remember that for a long time, the study of Scripture was controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, of which I fondly am a member. And there was a lot of control. It started to loosen up, and it had already been loosened, obviously, in Protestant denominations. But people began to use new tools to look at the Gospels and to look at Scripture in general. And so they began to ask themselves, so how is it that these Gospels are similar but different? And this led to, ta-da, this is on your paper too, what is called the two-source, or sometimes the four-source hypothesis. So it's very clear when you read Luke and Matthew that they have a lot of stuff from Mark, and we know Mark is earlier. So clearly, Luke and Matthew knew Mark. Some version of Mark, maybe not the exact version, okay? Because there are different codices, different ways they were written down. But there's also things in Luke and Matthew that are very similar to each other, but are not in Mark. So where did they come from? So this led German scripture scholars to use the word Quelle, abbreviated with a Q. Quelle means source. So they said somewhere out there, there had to be a source of other information about the teaching and preaching and miracles and parables of Jesus that was not available to Mark, but was available to Matthew and Luke. So already we see how these two major influences, Mark and Q, on Luke and Matthew. Now, let me say something more about Q. Some scholars have hypothesized, it's not clear to me, and perhaps if I'd read more, I could say this more definitively, and again, if either of the other religious professionals in the church might want to comment on this, feel free to do so. There's some sense among scripture scholars that Q may have been written down and existed as an actual document. It does not exist anymore. Nobody has ever found it. But the reason the thought is it may have existed in written form is that there are some things in Matthew and Luke that are almost word for word the same. So the chances of that being just from an oral tradition, it's possible, of course, but we've already talked about what happens with oral tradition. So Q may have been written down, and it may have been written down around the same time of Mark. Mark did not know Q, because clearly all of this material is not in here, okay? All right, so we've got these two major influences on Matthew and Luke, Mark and Q. But that doesn't cover the waterfront for Matthew and Luke. Matthew has some things that are only in Matthew. Luke has some things that are only in Luke. So that leads us to know that there has to be a small Matthew, another source for Matthew, and a small Luke, another source for Luke. Let's give some examples. Again, these you are probably familiar with. The infancy narratives. We have two very different infancy narratives. And when I grew up, the whole thing was how to make them mesh together. So they're really not two stories. They're just different parts of... No way. It just doesn't make any sense. The Lucan Christmas story is the one where the angels appear to the shepherds, and the shepherds come to Bethlehem. And why are Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem? Actually, is that right? No, forget that part for a minute. I may be wrong about that. Yeah, they're in Bethlehem because of the census. The Matthean story about the Nativity is the wise men. And it's very interesting because the wise men come to a house. There's no stable, there's none of that stuff, okay? And there's no shepherds, and there's no angels. There's the star, okay? And so it's very different. And it serves the theological purpose of each of those writers. We're going to talk about Luke's infancy narrative in some detail in the next couple of weeks. But just to make a point, Matthew is trying to show in his gospel, again, how Jesus is a lot like Moses. And so it's the birth of this great figure who causes the stars to change and lead wise men from far away to come and worship him. And then he has to sneak off into the night, his parents do, because Herod's going to kill him. None of that is in Luke. Moses also is shown in the Old Testament as an important figure at his birth, and he also had to be hidden, you may remember, in the bulrushes, because there was fear that because he was a Jewish boy, he would be killed by the Pharaoh at the time. So there's these parallelisms between the way Matthew approaches the infancy narrative and his overall theme of making Jesus appear like Moses. Now, let me give you another example of how Matthew and Luke use the material from Q differently. So we all know on the first Sunday of Lent, I think it's the first Sunday of Lent, we have the story of the temptations. Is that right? Okay. And there's the three temptations. They do not appear in Mark. In Mark, after Jesus' baptism, the Spirit drives him out into the desert where he's tempted by Satan, and we don't know how he's tempted. Okay? In Matthew and Luke, we have the three temptations. And I'm probably going to get these wrong or forget one of them. One of them has to do with turning stones into bread. One of them has to do with standing on the pinnacle of the temple and throwing yourself off, and the angels will get you and save you. And the other one has to do with standing on a high mountain. And I will give you, the devil says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you bow down and worship me. Okay, so Matthew and Luke both have the first temptation about the bread, turning the stones into bread. That they have the same. But they reverse the other two. Can you think of why? In Matthew, this notion of making Jesus to be like the new Moses makes the last temptation the one on the mountaintop. If you bow down and worship me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. Luke has the last temptation being throw yourself from the temple. And we'll talk about this more in weeks to come, but Luke has as an overarching theme in his gospel the journey of Jesus to Jerusalem, where he is going to suffer and die, and where the church is going to be born from. So, for their own theological purposes, they reverse the order of those two. Okay? It's clearly from Q, because if you look at it, the words are almost the same. They just put it together in a different way. Okay? All right. I think that's probably enough. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but let's have the actual question period now. Anyone?
Richard again.
What languages were the Gospels written in?
I want to say Aramaic, but
Greek.
Yeah, Greek. So some of them were they spoke Aramaic, but then they were written in Greek by the time they were written. So, for example, in Mark, you see him use a lot of Aramaic expressions, which he then has to explain to his audience because they don't know anything about that stuff. But they were written in Greek. Sorry for not.
Was there a reason for that? Was Greek the language of intellectuals at that point?
Yes, was Greek the
Aramaic is the common language.
Exactly.
Spoken by the other.
Yeah, exactly. This is the time of Hellenism. You know, it's the time when Greek culture is permeating the world. And although Rome is the dominant power and Latin is certainly spoken in the corridors of power, Greek would have been more the common language throughout that Mediterranean basin.
So the oldest version of the New Testament is probably Greek.
Yes.
Whereas the Old Testament is probably...
You know, again, my brain is not functioning as well as it should
Hebrew.
be. Hebrew,
yeah.
I was thinking that would be logical, yeah.
Hebrew differs from Aramaic in what way?
Hebrew is the formal version of Aramaic. You know, Aramaic was the street language that developed from Hebrew. And so in the same way that, you know, like kind of a Yiddish, think about that. And
Yeah, Aramaic would have been what Jesus spoke. It would have been what the people in Jesus' time spoke. But the scrolls would have probably been in Hebrew.
I got Elaine and I got Rick. Ladies first.
I wondered how much the regional aspect in these, because some of them were spread way far along the Mediterranean, and some went to the east. So how much, was there anything they could tell from what was written after?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is it's pretty complicated, but what I tried to do was say by the emphases of the different writers gave a sense of what region they were from. And what was more important, I think, than the region was what was going on in that Christian community influenced them. Now, having said that, Luke has the story of the prodigal son, the only gospel. He's possibly the most Eastern of the Gospels, although I don't know if that's actually true. If you remember in the prodigal son, the father sees the son from a long way away, returning, and he goes running down the road. And one of the things I remember from scripture study when I was very younger, much younger, is Oriental potentates do not run. They're carried in litters. So that's very Eastern kind of thing, and possibly reflects some of what Luke was aware of the culture. And it also, think about the power of that image. You know, if an Oriental potentate is running down the road to embrace his horribly, disobedient son, what does that say about God, right? I mean, it's a powerful, powerful image. So it may have some regional elements.
So this concept of queue, the concept
Queue.
of a queue existing, and how it helps explain some of these similarities in these two gospels, kind of fascinates me. And did we come up with a queue to explain something we couldn't figure out? Is there anything more concrete that Q or whoever it was it actually existed? Sometimes, when you can't explain something,
Yep.
you come up with something to just help you get over that, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that I'm qualified to answer it, except people smarter than I have been pretty convinced that Q is a thing, is the only way to explain this. Because as I said, the similarities are so strong that it had to come from some common source, and it's clearly not Mark, because why would Mark just ignore all that stuff if he was aware of it? So, we got another one in the back.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Ron. In thinking about the different audiences, like especially in thinking Matthew and Luke, how Luke seems to be written for more a Gentile's perspective. Was there any thinking among the scholars that's calibrated to someone coming from a Greco-Roman pantheon tradition versus a Judaic tradition, or were the authors modulating the story based on the historical approach to religion that population would have had?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think I can only give you, a partial answer to that, just because of my limited knowledge. And it kind of goes back to what I said. Matthew clearly modifies his gospel to get across the point that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures and the new Moses, the new lawgiver. Luke clearly modifies his story, and this is particularly clear if you remember, as I'm sure you all know, Luke and Acts were written by the same person, and they were written to be companion volumes. It says Luke begins his gospel by saying who he's addressed it to, and in Acts he says, as I said in my first book, I want to go on. So you clearly see Luke's concern is for universal salvation. It's not simply about the Jews. The Jews are important, and the Jews had their part to play in bringing that message out, but we're now beyond that, okay? So that's how things are modified. It's more according to the theology behind the gospel writer. And again, when I grew up, we never thought that there was a theology behind this. It was just they wrote what Jesus did. They wrote what Jesus said. But as we became more sophisticated, we began to see these more as literature, and all literature has a point of view. And if it's going to be religious literature, it's going to have a theological point of view. Maybe we have time for one more? I am done.
Oh, okay. Luke begins the gospel by addressing someone named
Theophilus.
Theophilus. Is that a person or is that a concept?
It appears to be a person. Whether it's a historical person or not, I don't know.
The name is Theophilus, which means lover of wisdom. So
Yeah.
it's maybe a person or maybe it's like that's, happen to have that name, right? Yeah.
Right. It's not impossible that somebody could have been named that in the Greek world, but it's definitely written to a person, and he's theoretically an important person in the world of the time. All right. Yep.
Ancient texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, are they too early for this period?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are written before and during the Gospels. They have a long tradition. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1940-something is part of what ushered in the new age of Scripture scholarship, because for the first time we had documents, non-biblical documents, that gave us a way of understanding the language, the customs, and the culture in which the Scriptures developed. So it gave us a way of looking at those things. They were non-biblical in that they never made it into the Bible, but they were many of them were all contemporary to either the.
Didn't know they existed, I guess.
Exactly. Well, people would have known about the Essene community, but they were very secretive, and so I don't know how much of their literature got out in those days.
Since it's not a lot, because we didn't even know about it.
Exactly.
I'll just say something to close us up and to give thanks to Ron here. Every youth group that I've been involved with as a child or as an adult, has had a 14-year-old boy, it's always a boy, who says, the Gospels were written anonymously, and do you know that not all Gospels made it into the Bible? And a hush went through the land, and the priest has to say there and respond to these teenagers something about canonicity and authority and all these things, which does it, so what I'm trying to say is that Ron has walked us through the last 150 years of biblical scholarship, in which has resulted in most people, this is why the churches aren't full anymore, because the historical critical method hit and people said, well, I guess it's not, and so then we're getting these deeper questions about truth, and epistemology and the theology of the church and everything like that, and that's where, and so I'm thankful for Ron gently presenting it, because sometimes it's presented and people are like, well, I could just leave, because it's, so.
And not to take away the last word from you, but to me, this question, this hit me square in the face in my very first year studying theology in a course on the Pentateuch. That same thing, it's like, but then it was like, my God, this enriches my understanding of all of this. This deepens my faith, because this very human process gave us these incredible texts that have so much to teach us. So I think people can express it in a way to make you doubt your faith, and that may be their goal. But I find just the opposite about it. The more we can understand it that way, the better and stronger our faith can be.
Evolution in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One could argue, base argument for Constitution, but I don't think they are at all. Darwin is mistaken that I have the freest argument that they were conflict either. So, go from that. But it's, there's a lot of people who just take everything in literal. We're challenged.
Yeah.
If anything that comes out that changes that literal interpretation, then
Sounds like Hal's going to get the last word.
Yes, right. So actually I am. I want to remind everyone, I'm sure Charles will as well, but we have a time change next week, so keep that in mind, because the last time that happened, there was like half the people for session 2. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you. Huh? We fall back. Would that mean we gain an hour?